Hello everyone, welcome. I'm Chef Simpson here at Conestoga College in the Baking and Pastry Management program, taking a look at some of the products we make within the courses. Within the chocolate confection program, we make an assortment of all different types of chocolates, and one of our big projects that we do at the end of the semester is make a chocolate sculpture. This year we're working towards making a chocolate dragon sculpture holding a pearl coming out of a jade mirror. It gives the students a real challenge on doing all sorts of aspects of chocolate confections, handwork, molding, and assembly to make what we see here in front of us. So here we have our full sculpture where everything has been combined over 7 weeks, but to the side we can see all the individual components that we use to assemble everything together. Today I want to take a closer look at what are the individual components that we have, how do we actually work with them, and let's make some assembly so we can see how they actually go onto the pieces. So here on our tray you can actually see some of the pieces that we have all throughout our dragon. We have the whiskers, we have a little bit of the edges and the ears, we have teeth, we have the eyes, the pearl that's down near the bottom, and it's some of the structural components that we use to make sure that we can ensure that it stays upright throughout the rest of the semester. So the sculpture itself is actually made of 2 different components. We have chocolate just by itself that's crystallized and formed into many different shapes that we see here. We also have here, which is something called modeling chocolate, and it's actually a combination of chocolate plus glucose that gives us the opportunity to actually mold and model this, almost like as if it was clay or Play-Doh. And this is how these shapes are made, and I want to show you a little bit more detail on actually how do we take this chocolate and mold it into these specific shapes. So our first step, what we're going to do is we have our modeling chocolate here right now, which is very hard. We can't really do much with it for shaping until we soften it slightly. So I've taken a little piece of that modeling chocolate off. I placed it in the microwave for about 5 seconds, and that was just enough to give me a bit more pliability in this so I can move, contort, roll, and shape it to any different shapes we want. So this now has become quite a bit softer. After about 5 seconds in the microwave, I've moved it around with my hands a little bit. And let's take a look at making a couple of these products that we see here. I'm going to place some gloves on. And once we have this unmolded, we can cut it into smaller pieces and start to make our shapes. So I'm going to break off a small little piece here, and I'm going to take this between my hands, and I'm using the warmth of my hands to help kind of soften it just a little bit more so it becomes more even in consistency and nice and pliable. And I want to remove any of the creases or crevices there, and then start to kind of shape between my hands. And then on the table I'm going to roll this back and forth. Let's make some of the whiskers that we see here. So I'm going to try to, as evenly as possible, roll this down, working it back and forth, out, and then back in a little bit to compress it to make sure that I can get it as smooth as possible. And once I know that I'm starting to remove all those kind of creases and it's getting nice and shiny, nice and smooth, I'm going to start to roll this down to the desired thickness that we need. Now as we see here, we obviously want to taper this down to give a nice kind of graceful curve to it at the same time. So I'm going to start to taking my one end here, and I'm going to start to roll this down a little bit thinner, keeping it thick on this end, but getting a bit more pressure with my one side of my right hand. And we can see it starts to taper off nicely. We have a couple options. We could do this by hand, or we could use a hard piece of cardboard and roll this back and forth, which sometimes gives a little bit more regularities. I usually compress the ends down just a little bit to give it its fineness and a nice little point on the edge. And once we have it to the desired kind of taper and the thickness that we're looking for, I'm going to cut a little piece off. I'm going to roll it just to ensure that it's nice and smooth again. And as we look at right now, this is very pliable still. But if we use that kind of warmth and pliability, we can shape this into a multitude of different shapes to give us that form that we're looking for in our products. And once that is actually set now for probably about an hour, it'll now become back nice and firm again and hold its shape the way we need it to be. And we can take this piece, let it firm up, and then eventually we'll come over and we use a little bit of chocolate with some spray, cold spray, to let it set up, and we'll actually place this onto our final products in all sorts of different shapes. Every piece we see here is made with some variation of our modeling chocolate. We have the whiskers, the nose was made exactly in the same fashion, a larger, much bigger version of it to make our horns, and even all these pieces off to the side to kind of give the little cowl around the side or the ears. We also have here other components that were made with colored modeling chocolate as well. So I have my dark modeling chocolate with what I've used. All these parts that are white right now were actually dark chocolate. And when I placed them all together, I let that harden over several days. And then I took white cocoa butter in a big spray gun and I sprayed the whole thing white. And then from that point forward, then I took some of my modeling chocolate that I used with white chocolate that had red cocoa butter in it. And this is what I was able to use to make the additional things, such as around the eyes, the eyebrows, the secondary whiskers, as well as the kind of the goatee on the bottom. And one of the things that's really important to think about when we're making chocolate sculptures is not just the kind of aesthetics and how all the pieces come together, but we also have to think about the structural components as well. So when we look at something like the goatee that you see down here, although it's a decorative element, inside that goatee is actually a solid piece of chocolate like you see right here. And this is actually meant to be a structural component that helps keeping the head from falling down, but we've used it as a decorative element at the same time by wrapping it in red modeling chocolate that gives us that nice visual at the same time. Some of the other components that we've made here is the eyes. They take a little bit more work to make, but I've used a very similar mold to what we see here on just a much smaller scale. And I piped a little bit of dark chocolate into the center, and then I took that, sprayed some white cocoa butter around it, and then I used some red cocoa butter with some gold dust behind it to give a nice visual representation of an eye. And with this one, I've taken this eye and I've actually melted it down. So I take a hot tray and I take this eye and I roll back and forth until it eventually starts to melt down to about half of its size. And then I'm able to attach these eyes exactly where you see there. I went back again with a little bit more of the red modeling paste and I rolled that out to a nice even taper like we see here. And I was able to kind of mold that around the eyes to give a nice kind of eyeshadow-like effect to it. Now, we see the scales on the back here, these weren't made from modeling chocolate. These are made from white chocolate that I added cocoa butter to. So just straight white chocolate with cocoa butter. And using a knife, a little bit larger one than I have here, I dip that into my chocolate, and then I dip this into some of my chocolate, and then on a piece of acetate, I dip my knife, lift it up, and I pull back, and it gives me that nice kind of feather or a scale-like effect to it. And once that hardened over about a half an hour, I was able to pull these pieces off, dip them in a little bit of chocolate, and I could attach them on the back here to give that kind of open-like scale effect to the dragon. When we see some of the other components that we have on the sides here, these were all made with our green modeling chocolate. And this green modeling chocolate is exactly like the other two. It's just white chocolate with a combination of cocoa butters to give us that color that we're looking for. And I wanted to get a color that kind of had a jade look to it to kind of tie it into the overall color theme of our product. And with this, I cut a piece of this off. I warmed it in the microwave for about 5 seconds, and then I was able to roll these out to make long cylindrical even forms. And these long cylindrical forms were the ones that were able to get the outside of the mirror decorative. And just like before, I was able to take these while they were still soft, and I could mold and manipulate them into shapes. I can also take this mass, warm it up, and if I roll this between 2 layers of parchment paper, I can now make cutouts with it. And this is where you can see on the top here, I'll be able to make that little medallion or coin. And it's also the same technique I used to make any of the flat areas you see here. So we can tell this little chocolate piece became the kind of wrap around the ear. And all I did with this one is I rolled that flat between 2 layers of parchment paper, and then I could use a tool very simply such as a knife or even just a little modeling fork, and I could do all these little marks or pleats throughout the chocolate to give a nice decorative effect to it. Same thing was done with this one as well, rolled between 2 pieces of parchment paper, and I just used whatever I could find to give me some different kind of visual elements and different patterns that we can create. And then while it was still soft, I was able to take this and shape it down to make the side here. I also used this to make the bottom on our goatee. And this is the same technique that I said used to make those eyebrows as well. And the goal with this one is we're trying to make this product without the use of too many specialized tools. The hands are the most important tools when we're in baking and pastry, and they can be used to manipulate and make all sorts of shapes. So we probably used maybe about 6 different actual tools, simple things such as a knife, or just something we find that has a good shape that we can compress into it. But beyond that, this is really about developing hand skills and showcasing how we can place it all together to create a beautiful sculpture. Now, to take a look at how did we get that pattern into the base of our sculpture, we know that this base and the sides here are there for structural integrity, but we also want to give it a visual element as well. So what I actually did with this one is we took some white chocolate and I crystallized that white chocolate, and then I separated it into 4 different containers. And each one of those containers, I added a different color of cocoa butter to create a white, a yellow, a light green, and a dark green. And once those had firmed up to the consistency we see here, I ground them up to make a nice kind of almost an aggregate for it. So it's very much almost like making kind of concrete. And once I ground these up, you can see, it's a little hard to see there, but we can see all the different colors mixed together in different size pieces. I took this and I mixed it with some colored cocoa butters and then compressed it into a form, which gave me a very rough looking surface. And then I took that piece out and I melted the top surface and ran a spatula across it, and that revealed the pattern that we see here. All these little pieces of aggregate kind of get scraped clean and flush once melted, and it gives us that nice visual element that looks very much like an old-fashioned kind of terrazzo style floor. Most of the pieces on here are all made by hand, but we do have a few pieces that we've modeled or molded into polycarbonate molds as well. So if we take a look at these molds, this is an egg-shaped mold that we often use in Easter to make giant decorative Easter eggs. But here we've actually used it to do the foundation or basis of the head. We have two kind of polycarbonate bases that are attached together with chocolate. So we use chocolate as a glue when we're making products to help give shapes and textures. We can see here that we're able to make a nice round sphere from using 2/2 of this mold, or we take two molds and sandwich them together and we can make the whole foundation of the head. And then from there, we can cut out for the mouth, add additional pieces of modeling chocolate, and give ourselves all those visual elements that expand from there. Thanks for joining me, everyone. And I hope you had the opportunity today to learn a little bit more about how we put something like this together and all the components that go towards it.